Hey, welcome to Live from America podcast. This is Hatem, and alongside me, returning guest. Love to always have him, Scott Klug. He's a former four-term Republican congressman from Wisconsin, who built a unique career in the intersection of journalism, media, and politics. Before being a congressman, he was an Emmy Award-winning reporter working in Seattle and Washington, D.C., and now he's here. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me back.
Great to see you again. It's been a while. I think the last time was the election night, was it?
Yeah, I think so. So we did a podcast for about 16 months that led up to the election in 24 called Lost in the Mirror, America's Political Orphans. And we took a look at a lot of the issues that were sort of driving stuff. We're right back at it again, right? Redistricting fights. There's a whole chunk of us, I think, who can't, we're sort of in the middle, but the two parties have gone crazy. And then we ended it with the election because I didn't want to stick around and do a podcast every week on the fight over the earned income tax credit in the Ways and Means Committee. And we'd sort of talked on the big issues. And so we sort of put it to bed for a while, but thankfully, you and a bunch of your fellow podcast hosts sort of dragged me in as a moderate in the Midwest to try to figure out what the hell's going wrong with the
Yeah,
country.
it's insane, huh? So let's start with something like we were talking about the World Cup before that a little bit, and how it's crazy everywhere. It's gonna be like from June 11th. It's just like the tickets of everything, hotels, flights, and it's funny because the World Cup used to be. I mean, FIFA is very greedy, but it used to be like a affordable ticket for the kids to be able to experience that. But you come here and it's thousands of dollars and hundreds of dollars. Some of them are thousands and just the whole expenses. But
Well, so
do you feel it?
we were talking. I actually have my oldest son lives in Atlanta, and I went to buy tickets. And there's a buddy of mine in Wisconsin who runs a ticket agency that's sort of in the Midwest. And I've got a son in LA, so I'll call him when I want to go get Laker tickets, or I'll call him when one of my boys wants to go to see the Packers and Jets in this fall or whatever the case might be. But I call him about World Cup, and it's weird because you don't actually buy tickets; you buy zones. It's the
Yeah.
way the Europeans do it. So there's zone 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you look at a map, basically in a stadium, zone 1 is sort of between the 10-yard lines in a football stadium. Zone 2 is in the corners. 3 is one more level up. 4 is one more level up. But I have no idea whether I'm on the 7-yard line or I'm on the 50-yard line. And I think by
Yeah.
the time you get past the VIP sections, especially in New York, I'm not quite sure what I bought. I'll find out in a few weeks. But I figure this is a once in a lifetime experience, and welcome to
Yeah.
next year's Christmas present. So
Yeah, no, 100%. And I have few tickets for different games, but the one I'm looking forward the most to is I have tickets for Iran versus Egypt. And I want to see how is that gonna be, you
yeah,
know,
the Sunnis
especially
versus the Shia at mid court. So
and it's funny because like everybody's got, it's I don't know if you've been to a soccer game. I mean, like all sports, it's very passionate, but it's like a little bit extra. So with everything going on, that passion can be understood, hopefully not misunderstood, but so yeah, it's gonna be in Seattle too. So it's funny how like some of these games are in state, like say New York. There's a lot of like different cultures here, but there's some states where they're like never seen any of the cultures, and they're gonna get hit hard.
well, Kansas City is the perfect example, right? That's the closest one to here, aside from Chicago. And I can't imagine what Kansas City's in for. No,
Oh yeah.
not only to say Kansas City, how would you like to fly in from Ghana from the match and drop in the middle of Kansas City, Missouri? So it'll be
Oh
it'll be an
yeah.
experience on both ends.
Oh, 100%, 100%. But it's I highly recommend people try to get to. I know it's expensive, but I think it's gonna go down. People just but it's once in a lifetime experience. You gotta experience it if you can. All right, so let's talk about, let's mix both of your world, politics and media. So the first thing I was at the one of the last, I think the one before the last late show for with Stephen Colbert, and Letterman showed up, and it was amazing episode. But now politics and comedy and the late show and media in general, what's your thought on that? Once in a while, late night comedy kind of shaped the political scene. Obviously, they're getting canceled because they're not making money. It's not that somebody's canceling them. It's just losing a lot of money. So that's just the nature of the business with the streaming service and all that. But you used to have, and also I feel like a lot of them are very both ends, left and right. They're very like they have an agenda now. It used to be funny is funny. What do you think of that? How do you think that the new generation is going to be affected by, the political jokes that used to be in a daily, nightly basis and all that? And what's your thought on canceling late night shows? And
Well, so I'm a guy who never even watched the Tonight Show when I was a kid growing up, which had nothing to do with 10:30 at night. I just sort of, I don't really need to see Johnny Carson and Zaza Gabor have one more conversations. I think culturally I've got boys who are in their 30s. So for them, it'll be a big step back, right? Because they were regular fans and they grew up, they all watched Letterman and then transitioned to Colbert and transitioned to a lot of stories. I think it's an interesting comment sort of on the American news scene, that and television scene generally, there's nothing that unifies us anymore. I mean, people would turn in to a couple of, the nightly news with Walter Cronkite, or everybody would turn in for the Academy Awards, which is now moving to a streaming service. It's completely changed. And I worked in television for years when everybody watched local news. In fact, I always joke, when I first ran for office, I ran against a Democrat who had been for 32 years. And we didn't have a lot of money. So we could only afford one poll. So in September of that year, we did our one poll. And the pollsters came back and said, we have good news and bad news. And I said, okay, what's the good news? And it's like, well, he's got 46%, you've got 46%, and 8% are undecided. And traditionally, the old political philosophy was the undecideds break against the incumbent, right? If they liked him, they'd say that. They said, but there's one really weird thing in polling. And I said, what's that? They said, you literally have the highest numbers of any Republican in the country from people over the age of 60. Where does that come from? Well, while they were all puzzled trying to figure this out, I knew it immediately, right? Because this is the old days where everybody watched TV, watched the news at 6, watched at 11. And then what happened after the 6 o'clock news, it was always some kind of game show. And at that era, our 6 o'clock newscast, I was on an ABC affiliate, for the first time in like 20 years, was number one at 6 o'clock. Not because I was charming and brilliant and, handsome and well coiffed when I had more hair. The answer was Wheel of Fortune was on after us. And everybody turned on who was over the age of 60 to watch Wheel of Fortune and then probably hang around to watch Jeopardy in its heyday. So I think what's disappeared a lot for everybody is there's nothing that really brings us together other than the Super Bowl. I mean, like I just said earlier, the Academy Awards going away. So the Late Show, I think, has sort of just died by viewing habits because now you don't have to watch it. You can watch it the next morning. You can watch it 4 at the afternoon the next day. So I think it's just basically died in the way that traditional television is really dying.
yeah, for me, it used to be, I like, especially like somebody like I loved Conan the most from the late night. I think it's just hilarious. But the way when something happened, the reaction, the comedy reaction to it that night. So you have to write something really new, really, that was very refreshing for me. And he always says like, oh, I cannot wait to see what Letterman's going to say about it, or Conan is going to say about it, Chappelle is going to say about stuff like that. So, but I feel, that, just the task of writing a joke in the day of and make it hilarious, I think that's going to be missed. Obviously there's a lot of, social media now, so people react to it in a certain way, but it's funny how like people play videos and they just react to it like with their face, And there's nothing more funny to me when the new mayor election with Mamdani doing all these, viral thing when Combs was trying to do like a TikTok dance. It's like, shut up, come on.
Yeah, you got to be a certain age to pull it up. So Chris Farley was from Madison, Wisconsin, who was a big hit on Saturday Night Live in the day and had lots of movies afterwards. And Chris actually did events for my campaign. And when after I got elected, a guy in town who was a magazine writer said, I want to go out to New York and do a profile on Chris because he was a big star for Madison, Wisconsin. Could you help set it up? Which I did. So we fly out to New York, meet him at the studios at like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're sort of wandering around and, meeting the whole cast in the hallway and everything else in the world. And we're sort of beginning to watch early rehearsals. And all of a sudden at like 8 o'clock, Chris comes and says, you got to go. And it's like, why? He says, because you got to go, because now they're going to start rewriting stuff and throwing out bits, and people are going to be pissed because their bit's going to be gone, and it's going to get tense here. It's going to get ugly. So get out of here. I'll see you after the show. So we got thrown out. So I can only imagine what it must be like in a room for writers trying to write spots for somebody on the Letterman show or, the Colbert show an hour before they go on the air. Just the level of tension that's in there and the grind of that 5 days a week. I can't imagine that pressure.
Yeah. And
I knew Chris well, just to know the pressure was on the cast members. In some ways, it was far more pressure on the writers than it was on the cast members.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think, I think as a culture thing, that late night show is kind of like it's an art form that should be kept. But the problem is, for example, the Late Show, Stephen Colbert is losing $40 million, losing 40 million. So when I went there, it's just like you see the production and you see how much you can save in this. I mean, they could be a combination of saving money, but also, I think people are sick of just one-sided, even if you are on their side. I mean, and it used to be like you, it's like the only thing that unites us is even like sports or the Super Bowl. But even then, like which halftime show that you're gonna watch,
Yeah.
As soon as it's gonna be which quarterback and which announcer, and it's just so crazy.
And yeah, it's changed in a lot of ways, and in some ways, I think it's a shame that that's happened. I mean, I remember the first VCR I bought. I was working in local television in Washington D.C. All of us in the newsroom got together to buy VCRs because it was like AI in its day. You couldn't believe it. We all bought these AIs. These VCRs were two. You had to carry it in the house. But the reason I bought it was because living on the East Coast, Saturday Night Live started at 11:30. But then SCTV started at 1 a.m. And even when I was 27 years old, I was not going to be able to stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning watching SCTV. And that was it. We had to have SCTV to tape it, to carry through with it. Yeah, it's a shame. And it's, at some point I'm going to have these conversations with my grandchildren, and it's going to be like the days people gathered around the radio to hear FDR's address in 1940. It's changing around us, and there's no way to put it back. And it's a shame on one level. But back to your point about sort of the one-sidedness, I'm active with former members of Congress, and they send us out as Republicans and Democrats to talk to college campuses so they can see we can have an argument without a night fight in the auditorium. And I was talking to a teacher at Suffolk University in Boston, and she says, we're so glad to have you here because we try to get students involved in campaigns, and we want them to see different sides of it. In fact, what I always do is I give my students a list of movies to watch that are all political stories. And I said, fascinating. In any of those stories, is the Republican a good guy? And she said, well, no. I said, well, okay. Point well taken. I meant, it sort of tilts one direction in Hollywood and to some degree in showbiz, and it always has, and you're not going to change it by complaining about it. But I think that's just an indication, I think, sometimes why a lot of folks center right will push back on a lot of the comedy, because it seems to be, and traditionally has always been one-sided. I mean, I think all the presidents should get the crap kicked out of them just because they'll deserve it from time to time. So I don't involve in censorship, but I just think from my viewpoint, there'd be a lot of eye rolls just to saying, really, can we look at something else for a while? But I think the LA mayor's race is going to provide a lot of laughs going forward. And I think Mandini's going to have his shares of sort of, just because he's, from my perspective, a little bit wacky. The government running grocery stores sounds like we're in the Czechoslovakia in 1968. I don't really get it. So
yeah, what's interesting is when you say Republican, Democrat, like if you listen to any speech from a Republican or a Democrat back in like maybe old speeches like 40 years ago or 50 years ago, and have somebody who listened to it now that they wouldn't think that a Republican is a Republican. They would think he's a Democrat, the way they talk.
Yeah.
Because the way it shifted, it's so crazy. Like Republicans back in the day were probably more Democrat now than the Democrat, and far away from the Republican than they are.
Yeah, it's really completely flipped out. So I'm sort of a libertarian, small government Republican, and I look at the amount of money that Trump is spending, and probably one of the prouder points of my political career, because I was there in the 90s, is when Clinton and Newt Gingrich actually managed to balance the budget. And we haven't even come close to that. Now it's just every party antes up more. So if the Republicans want to spend more money on the military and other crazy, and more monuments in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
and the Democrats have never met a social program they haven't liked. And so, in my sense, is a lot of times you set up programs to solve these social issues, and at the end of the day, you still have the same social issues. Now you just have a bureaucracy making you fill out forms in Washington.
So back to the media thing, I think is like because of, people either on one side, either Republican, like or very left or very right, and nothing is unifying us. And then you have this new thing where everybody say like, oh, I'm in the middle, I'm not left and right. But I feel like from my point of view, it's all business, because that sells if you produce if you like cheerlead for one side, you're gonna sell if either views or scripts or whatever, or shows or anything. And same thing with the right, And also it's the new business of I am really in the middle, and I don't care, and it's also a business. But I don't think anyone is really like there's very few that actually can look you in the eye and say like, hey, Trump did some good things and did some horrible things. Obama did some good things and some horrible things. It's always one thing. So is it just a business to sell views and stuff?
Well, let me sort of unpack two parts of that. It's hard at this point that I can point to a lot of people in Washington who I think really vote like centrists and do it very thoughtfully. And unfortunately, one of them, Bill Cassidy, just got beat this weekend in Louisiana. And Cassidy was a guy who would always get through the primaries and then run from the middle of Louisiana. Louisiana is a pretty red state, but he could gather enough folks to sort of hold off the crazies on the way right and get reelected. Great guy. And was a doctor, served in the House, did a lot of great stuff, had a great voice as a provider, had a lot of experience and voices on healthcare issues just because he had the technical knowledge to do it. And that's the sort of guy I hate to see get beat. We need more people like that. And the fact that he voted once against Trump on one of the impeachment articles is just ridiculous. And the same thing, some of those purity tests are obviously going to be tested on the Democratic side as we go forward. And I think that's a shame. But let me, if you look at the numbers, the folks in the country who self-identify as independents is really climbing. It's the largest registration in Arizona. It's the largest registration in New Hampshire. But the problem with folks who are independents is they're independents until they get you and me in the room and we're both independents. And then we start thinking about gun control and abortion and prayer in school and everything else in the world. And pretty soon we're in the same fist fight anywhere. But what I really view that as, is a sense from people that they want a different tone in Washington. And the word's not compromise, right, Tim? Because compromise sounds like you gave me something and then I gave away something I really believed in. It's collaboration. I mean, we may even talk about this on the last podcast. You and me and three guys we drag into a diner in Brooklyn can figure out the general architecture of immigration reform before the scrambled eggs are on the table. It's not very complicated. Better border security, it's a pathway for people who've been here a long time. And so that's what really frustrates me. And, there's the classic example is, Trump got beat up. The Republicans got beat up this time around when the Senate handed over an immigration bill because Johnson wanted it as an issue in the presidential campaign 2 years ago. Shame on Mike Johnson. Shame on Chuck Schumer because they had a deal in 2006 that Bush got, and this time it came from the House, and Chuck Schumer killed it in the Senate because he wanted it as a campaign issue for Obama. I think that's what the American public gets exhausted by, where it's not about getting things done for people. We can disagree on the solutions, but it's just the sense that I'm against you just on principle because of what your party is.
So I have two questions. One, you mentioned, he just lost, and one of the reasons because he voted against for the impeachment of Trump. But as a congressman or any public server, you're supposed to be taking care of your own district and your own people. So if you have done a good job, wouldn't you just always get the votes? Or is it money? Or is it like I feel like if you're obviously I don't. So but my thought process is like, okay, money can buy you a little things of, and all the miss ads and all this, it's fine. But if you do a good job, aren't you gonna just always win?
No, Look at the part of it is in the primaries, the extremes dominate, right? So Cassidy not only loses, he's in third place in the vote in the Republican primary because Trump weighs in. But look at the Senate race in Maine, right? You have a governor who's been high marks as a governor in Maine for years, you know, a long sort of distinguished track record. And now she drops from the race because a guy on the left who, you know, harvests clams for a living says he's going to fight against the Republicans tooth and nail, and that's what the Democratic base wants. So it's really a problem on both parties, but it's a problem for the system because people who actively campaign on trying to get things done usually have a hard time succeeding, quite frankly, and it's a problem. And in Wisconsin, so we've got 8 seats. 2 of them in Madison and Milwaukee are always going to be Democratic seats. And then of the 6 that remain, 5 of them are Republican seats. And this year, sort of one of them is a jump ball on the district that goes along the Mississippi from the Iowa-Wisconsin border up to Minneapolis. And the seats are wired because of gerrymandering, but the seats are also wired these days because people self-select, right? If you're in northern Wisconsin, chances are you're not a Democrat. If you're in if you're in downtown Milwaukee, you're going to be a Democrat. So it's not like anybody's skewing the maps just to hose people, although that happens clearly. What's just sort of happened is we as a country have self-selected where we want to be, and we want to be in a neighborhood where people are like us. And but you're also right. It's also flipped, right? Places that years ago were very Republican are now Democratic and vice versa. And it's largely in the suburbs where things have all moved around.
Yeah. My next question, which is, you know, I really want to get to the bottom of this. What is really independent voters? You know, because a lot of times I think if you are the opposite of something, or if you don't have options, that's not really independent. You know, it's part of it, but I don't think that's how it should be. You know, so if I don't like the left or right, then I am independent. Or if you have different solution and a mix of them, like what in your opinion, what is independent? Because a lot of people like say register independent because they don't feel attracted to the left and right, but then that's on its own is 2 options, you know. So
Right.
it's not really independent, you know. It's just the opposite of something. So what is, and to you, what is really independent?
Well, I think so I'll tell you the idyllic vision, and people who are hardened political guys just sort of shake their heads at me when I try to make this argument. I was on a guest show, another former members of office, and I was on with a New York congressman who used to be the chair of the Democratic Party. And we had a poster on talking about who's going to win the elections and sort of forecasting this stuff, the kind of thing you and I as political junkies will watch, and most of the public will gleefully tune out. But at the end, he said, Scott, you got the last word. And I said, here's my last word. How about a round of applause for Indiana and Maryland, which both refuse to do redistricting in order to tilt the states one way or the other? And he just looked at me, the guy was crazy. And I just said, people sort of want to see this happen. All right. Yeah. How naive am I? 5 weeks, 6 weeks later, whatever, after I said this, there was a primary in Indiana, and all of the Republicans who voted against redistricting got wiped out in the primary because Trump was mad at them for not redistricting to give them more seats. But I think a true independent values people who vote independently. Like I won a lot of bets last time out when Susan Collins was up for re-election because I think folks in Maine just respect her. She sort of does what she wants to do and picks a fight. It's the same reason that Lisa Murkowski gets elected in Alaska. She's a Republican, but she isn't shy at all about having fights if she doesn't like stuff. But over time, what's happened is, you know, the middle in both parties in Washington has disappeared. When Obama passed Obamacare in 12, there were 65 or 66 who self-described themselves as blue dog Democrats, right? They were in the middle. Most of them tended to be from the South, were more conservative culturally, more conservative fiscally, but value themselves as Democrats. Last election, you know how many of those were left? 9. There are 9 self-described moderate Democrats right now. And the week after the last election, they gathered in a conference room in Washington, D.C., because several of those people who survived were women. They weren't men, so they weren't sort of blue dog classic Democrats. And one of them was from Hawaii and another was from New York. So they said, we got to figure out a new name. And I remember what the new name was, the New Democrats or the Democratic Coalition or whatever the hell it was. And they walked out of the Capitol and they split into 2. So now one group has 5 members and the other group has 4 members. And I used to belong to the Tuesday group, which was the Washington moderate group in Washington, who similarly has seen its rank shrink. But even when I was there, I'm not sure how effective we were because we were the Tuesday group that met for lunch on Wednesday. So the moderates have always had trouble sort of sticking together. So I think part of people would truly like to see independence, like Fetterman, I think, sort of votes both ways. And I know he's got a fight on his hands now in Pennsylvania. But there are fewer and fewer people like that, and I think that's a shame. There's a group in Washington who's trying to actually run 10 people as independents in House seats. And they've targeted, for example, battleground seats. So there's a district in the Quad Cities, which is about a third of the way down the Mississippi River, and it actually straddles Mississippi, Illinois and Iowa. And there's a guy running in Iowa where the district has gone back and forth the last 3 or 4 elections with 51%, 49%. That Republicans have it now. I think the Democrats had it. But they're targeting these kind of races to see if an independent can really win. And if they would win, for example, 4 or 5 seats across the country, they control Congress because that's what the margin could be between Republicans and Democrats. So that'll be an interesting race, something to watch on the midterm elections to see if the independents really can win or not, be a 14% protest vote.
Should it be a movement in its own, or should it be correction to a party? Meaning more Democrats are leaning independent, more Republican leaning independent until the values of the party that they think it is should go back, and then they go back to where it belongs? Or independent, should it be always just a movement or maybe a third party?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, the interesting thing would be if somebody runs as an independent on a statewide level. I think it's hard to run as an independent in a congressional district just because they're, as we were talking about, sort of jury-rigged. So, if I'm a Republican running as an independent running in a district with a Republican and a Democrat, where the Democrats are going to take 60% of the vote in Madison, there's no way in the world I'm going to win as an independent because it's baked. But statewide races would be different. And you've got for Bernie, for better or loose, even though he caucuses with the Democrats, considers himself an independent. Although I don't know, Bernie's big break historically was he got elected in a race against a Republican who'd voted for gun control, ironically, and Bernie cuddled up to the NRA, and that was his first election. And then you've got the senator from Maine, Angus King. So it'll be interesting to watch the Maine Senate race to see what happens with King. And then there's a few Republicans who will vote more independent, but I think it's something the American public hungers for, but I may be naive. I mean, we'll know when people start to actually vote on this.
So a report came today in New York Times that Trump approval rating is the lowest ever for a second term. All this approval rating and polls and stuff obviously doesn't really matter in a way, but what does that say? And most of the time it's not even accurate, what does approval rating to you means?
Well, I think what really matters in most elections, frankly, still is the economy. If the economy's happy, people are happy and they'll vote for the incumbent. And if the economy sucks, the incumbent's in big trouble. And before we were on, I was reading the Jerusalem Post and Al Jazeera trying to get the view from the Middle East about what's really going on and whether fighting is going to resume or not. And even if fighting stops or they get a deal, it's going to take a while for that oil flow to get from, Iran to Indonesia. So if the Indonesian economy slows, maybe that means they're not buying Japanese cars. And if the Japanese economy slows, maybe they're not buying American computers. And so it goes. So I think Trump's was going to have challenges, period, in the midterm. But I think with, gasoline prices now approaching $7, $8 a gallon, close to $9 in California, I think that's not going to put people in a very good mood. And I think Trump's in trouble. And the second term of any president's always trouble. It's very hard to get stuff done in anything that really matters. And that, was true with Ronald Reagan. It was true with Bill Clinton in his reelection. And
the second term is usually about also legacy, but it doesn't feel that way, does it?
Yeah.
So let's talk about the midterms then. Two things, what do you think that the Trump effect, is he a liability or asset? And if you are running right now, would you disagree with him, or you want it like, or it just depends on the state? Obviously, it's so funny because by now we should have known kind of like who's going to be the Republican nominee for the president for the next one, and everybody's so scared of doing anything. It seems like he's still very strong, you know. So, do you think he's a liability or an asset? And if you were running right now, what would you do?
Retire.
I mean, would you like say the obvious and like try to attack Trump, or should you side with him and defend him? Like, what would you do?
Well, see, so my district was very much a swing district, and I ran as a Republican moderate. Still have the second highest independent voting record in Wisconsin in the last 50 years. But I would run ads at that point saying, I'm with the Republicans on this, but I supported family and medical leave when Clinton tried to pass it, just because I thought it was the right thing to do. I think what happens, unfortunately, is with redistricting now, the question will be Republicans who get beat in primaries because they buck Trump, right? And we've got another one coming up this week with a House member from Kentucky. And so bucking Trump in those Republican districts is going to be a loser. But the general nature of the country is, I think, the Democratic base is wound up. And I think the practical effect of that, folks who are more the Democrats who want to attack and fight Trump rather than be more low key about it, I think are going to win the primaries, which is going to exaggerate even further this thing. So I think Trump's numbers are pretty horrible. I don't know how hard it is to sort of forecast what happens after Trump, because he's a unique character. He's Jesse Ventura on steroids, or he's, Huey Long in Louisiana before, he was shot. He's sort of a personality, and personalities don't usually survive. Those sort of movements don't survive after they're gone. So when that happens, and to your key point at the beginning, does the deck reshuffle and the Democrats now recapture some working folks and the Republicans get the suburbs back? I don't really know. It's hard. I can't for the life of me figure out how Vance has any traction whatsoever, and you look at vice presidents who tried to run, it's not exactly a ticket to future success. I mean, Mondale got drilled. I mean, Dan Quayle never had a future. Al Gore got beat. I can't really even see Vance winning it. So that at this point sort of says Rubio, but I'm not really sure he can do it. And I think the Democrats are crazy if they have any serious discussions about Kamala Harris running again. I mean, she is a pretty flawed candidate, and I just don't. She was a bad candidate in a badly run campaign. So, but if you really think about it, she was going to be almost a continuation. If Biden was a continuation of Obama, then she was a continuation of Biden, and that's sort of 16 years of Democratic rule.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to stand. Like, that's why I think a Republican's going to have a really hard time winning after Trump.
Yeah, I think with the Republican, I think there's two kinds. There's that they have to distance themselves from Trump at some point, or they have to jump all the way at some point. But those who like did something against him the last year or a couple of years, they're gonna be doomed, because all the money's gonna be against them. He's gonna campaign against them. But if you try to right now to like split from him, I think that would be a smart move, because there'll be no enough time for him to rally the troops, sort of, or you gotta jump all in. I think Rubio, I used to like him, but I think he done a terrible job in a lot of things. The way he speaks, the no empathy part that he picked up from Trump, So I don't think he is a good he's the one that could maybe be very close to have some Democrats vote for him, but I don't think anymore,
I still think, as a general rule, the best candidates for president are governors, just because they have an executive order. You can define your state. And so if I was the Democrats, I'd clearly look at somebody like, Andy Bashar, who's the governor of Kentucky, I think would be a powerful candidate. Maybe the Republican governor of Utah, who's sort of independent streak, might be an interesting character if he'd run. So but I do think that over time, the Trump stuff will sort of purge itself out of the system. And I can't imagine if his kids try to run, if they'd have a chance in the world. I think people will just sort of go, it's not a monarchy. We're moving on. Thank you very much. So I think it's hard. So I think Republicans are going to have a tough election cycle this time out, and I think 28 will be a challenge. The one thing I worry about, and we sort of got close to this with Biden, and it worries me about Trump. If he goes downhill real quickly, who's going to have the guts in the cabinet to say this guy can't function anymore? He's still got 2 more years to go, and I think anybody who looks at him and looks at the late night tweets and stuff, a lot of with him, it's been performative and it's always been performative, right? But there's also, I think, some signs that he's an 80-year-old guy,
Yeah.
and I'd like to think I'm in my 70s now. I'd like to think, 10 years from now, I'll be as, allegedly sharp as I am today. But time just takes a toll on you. And that could really be a crisis in the country, because you'd have to have Republicans in the cabinet step forward to make the move. And then every crazy Trumper who still believes that the election was stolen is now going to be completely whipped up about they removed Trump from office because it's a purge to get rid of him, because that's what Washington always does. So as much as I'm not a fan of his, I hope we don't get to that point in the country, because it could be just a train wreck of epic proportions.
Yeah, and I feel a lot of people are gonna try to do his playbook, but I don't think they will succeed because you have to be him to do his playbook. He's a very unique personality. You have a combination of like he's a media actor, comedian, performer, entertainer in general, and he
Yeah.
likes he likes the light. He likes the spotlight. I cannot wait for like the time where people don't know who the president is anymore, or the vice president. It just it's crazy, but also the way it's not only the crazy things that he say in terms of like it's also what worries with me when he said like an entire civilization is going to be like these things as like it's not who we are and it's not how we should be talking, and it's just today I think he said like nothing will be left from Iran, like what is this? It's just especially when you so powerful. You never need to, like Bruce Lee said, like he never get in a fight because he can kick ass anybody. So why you're so powerful? You don't need to say this. And the more you say now, people are gonna be like, oh, you know what? You said that like 10 times, nobody cares. So
Yeah, and I don't understand the revenge tour. I just don't get it. It's not in my genetic makeup, And the sense in politics is you and I could disagree, and I may think you're a horse's ass, but next Tuesday I might need your vote. So you always keep the door, stuff going, and
yeah.
that's clearly not in Trump's DNA. And that's for a psychoanalyst, not me. But I don't like that the way he operates and the way he's handled a lot of stuff. I was there when I first got elected. Aside from Vanna White helping me win the election with Wheel of Fortune, I actually supported Desert Storm. So I'm in Madison, sort of the heart of the anti-war movement. And all I remember from that, we used to get these briefings in the Capitol where Schwarzkopf would come and sort of tell stories of what had happened today in the Desert Storm and the trying to get Iraq out of Kuwait. But Colin Powell, who actually was hoping to help his campaign if he ran for president. In fact, I'm not much of a collector of political paraphernalia and merchandise and stuff I've gotten over the years, but I have a handwritten note from Colin Powell that he decided not to run. But he told Bush Sr. with Iraq, after we got him out of Kuwait, if you go to Baghdad, they're not going to be able to stop us, but you break it, you own it. So now that's the problem with Iran. I mean, I don't know. How do you declare victory? What's victory? That they give us their nuclear materials and then we go. And if they decide not to do it, what are you going to do? I mean, and so I think we're in a real tough situation to figure out what we can do. I think at the end of the day, Iran's got real economic issues if they have no longer any place to store their oil, because if the oil wells get shut down, they never come back the same way. And they've already got, financial problems without being able to sell oil. But I'm not sure they're ever going to do that, because the problem is, if you've got a regime that's willing to machine gun 28,000 people, they really don't care if another 28,000 die from starvation. So it's a mess. I don't know how we're going to get out.
And that's why sanctions never really work, because the only people that suffer are the people, not you go to Saddam Hussein's palace and you see all these things, and see Cuban cigars and, ketchup and like all kind, like it's There's no sanctions war at him. He will know what to do. That's the thing. But what's crazy with Iran is he could have left after he killed Khomeini, and that would have been a historic victory for him, and say like, hey, I just want to get an evil guy out of the way, and now they would have been more scared. But now that they know, it's like, actually, I don't think they even knew that the Hormuz strain is like that powerful until now.
Well,
Um,
you have to be pretty. I mean, back to Trump. I don't know who he really listens to. You have to be pretty naive. I mean, I've been in Oman, and you can look across the Gulf, and you really can't see like the skyline or anything. But you know that Israel. You know that Iran is what 16 miles away, 14 miles away.
yeah.
It's sort of like it's like getting to the end of Long Island. I mean, it's pretty crazy how close it is. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out and how they extricate themselves from this. But I think you're right. The problem is it's got a bad populace, and I don't know how. That I had a funny story. So when we cut the deal with Iran and the Obama administration to put the sanctions in place, and they agreed not to do any kind of further nuclear development for 10 years or 12 years, whatever it was. There were some of us who were former members of Congress who've done a lot of informal work for the State Department. So when the United Arab Emirates was first thinking of holding some elections to put people on the governing board to advise the emir, I went to talk to some schools and then spoke to the State Department at Oman and said, "Good move, keep it up." Or I'm supposed to say, or the UAE, "Good move, keep it up." But so they announced this big deal, and so 8 of us reached out, 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats. The highest ranking delegation to go to Iran since the original fight with the hostages and Jimmy Carter is a U.S. wrestling team. Nobody's been in Iran officially from the U.S. since then. All the meetings were always held in Pakistan or in Bahrain or wherever they've been. So we said, what about if we bring 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats to Iran? And they said, why? And I said, well, because if we're going to sort of ease tensions with the countries, it'd be nice to start having some ongoing dialogues. And they said, well, what would you do? And we said, well, we could meet with members of parliament. You could take us to meet, show us some sites. You could show us something historical. But the idea would be we'd be there for 6, 7, or 8 days. And so everything seems hunky dory. They asked for a written plan. We send it. They send a letter back. And this sort of goes on and on. It never went anywhere, which we weren't surprised. And what we were told was the guy who was going to be the one who headed up this delegation was going to be, somebody the U.S. can do business with. So my phone rang about a month ago, and I pick it up, and it's Larry LaRocco, who's a Democratic congressman from Idaho, who's a bud, and Larry was in on this cabal trying to see if we could get it going. And he says, he said, I never got to go to Iran. And I said, yeah, because they didn't want us to come. And he said, well, now we're not going to go. And I said, why is that? He said, the guy we met with, Aaron Jari, he just got taken out last night.
Oh.
So it was so for us, it's going, he was supposed to be the nice guy, except he's the guy, he was the head of security, 28, machine gunned down 28,000 people. But the thing that fascinated me was his his kids all went to school in the United States. One of them was a teacher at Emory University. And then one of the other senior guys has 2 daughters in Los Angeles who are doing, they've got their own social media channels. So it's bizarre. So
Yeah.
back to I think the folks who, run the government are always going to make sure their kids live in the West. And
Yeah.
meanwhile, the Iranians in the street suffer because of how crazy their leadership is.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I don't know if you know that I was born in Kuwait. So I kind of witnessed the first desert, the Desert Storm, the first Gulf War. But I think what, George Bush Senior did brilliantly was he formed a coalition, even if it wasn't, seemed like quite like I think that was the best work coalition from the Muslim country, from the Arab country, had a clear vision of what winning is. And even, everybody had a line. Like I remember the Muslim and Arabs, they said that we're only going to go to Kuwait, we're not going to enter Iraq, and that was, the way that they dealt with the Saudis and, and being in the holy sites at that time was unique, for American troops. And And there was no talk arrogance. There was no. It was always, oh, we together. Even with the Schwarzkopf book, and Prince, I think Khalid was, um, how they work together, and he always give him you know, um, the leadership sometimes, and it was a very good coalition, and it was, I feel like we're more alone than ever, we take everybody away from even action, and then after that we say like, hey, why not helping? We're paying more, you're doing this. um, so yeah, and it was a clear. That's the thing with Iran, that I think is a major problem, is like all the cards. You know how he always say, you don't have all the cards. He doesn't have all the cards. Because and the more you stay, and this is my major problem, and I think it was the same thing with the Gaza war, is like the more you stay, the more you do horrible things. Speaking of the Gaza, when you call, yeah, Hamas is a terrorist organization, obviously when you start killing civilians, there's some people gonna turn to just defend their homes. So there are some people in the government, and there's some people now in Iran that just want to defend they hate Ayatollah. There's no question how evil they are, but you're not gonna, and then the worst thing you can do is just weaken the regime, but not too much, enough to kill their own people, but also to have some other terrorists start to form and have that, thing. So it's crazy.
Yeah, sort of 2 points on this. But the one thing is, Iraq was complicated and it came apart at the seams. And then if you start goofing around with Iran, you really got problems, right? Because everybody talked about the Kurds we were going to arm the Kurds and we're going to march to Tehran. Well, that's not going to work. But anyway, if you start to get the Kurds restless and you give them weapons, guess what? Then they got a problem in Iraq. Then you got a problem in Turkey. Now it's really gone to hell. The Baluchis on the far eastern part border on Afghanistan and Pakistan. They're already, Pakistan's worried about them. Now we can destabilize Pakistan while we're at it. And then, oh yeah, then there's also the Azeris who are with Azerbaijan, who want their own country. I mean, you could have 4 civil wars going on, disrupting the entire region. And so, it's very, very complicated. It's
And
hard to
as
figure.
much as maybe that is the goal for certain,
Oh,
government to have that, but my problem with that is always civilians pay the price. And
yeah.
then that vicious circle of like when somebody loses all his kids and family, what are they gonna become? You know? And what vision do they have about the US or
So
the
the
West?
one thing I don't understand, and I know we're getting close to the end here, though, is the UAE, right, is now allied itself more with Israel and clearly close to the U.S. And Iran clearly doesn't like them. But if I'm not mistaken, almost all of the Iranian money flows through the UAE.
Yeah.
So if the UAE was serious about this, it's like the Europeans with the Russians. If you're serious about it, there's like $800 billion they're sitting in a bank in Brussels, like
Yeah.
Vladimir. We got till next Thursday, or we're taking that money. And the same thing with the UAE. And nobody's been able to answer this for me. If all the money transits through banks in the UAE and they go, none of that money, then the Iranian regime collapses. So I don't, there's like 2 pressure points that I don't understand have been executed in either case.
Yeah.
So
I think they're too close. They're afraid that they're gonna get hell of, which is interesting because they got more missiles than anyone. It's close. So we heard a lot during the Iranian war about like the Israeli influence. All the what is like from your time, like and what's your thoughts in that? Does Israel really have a say or power or influence? Um, in the government decision making, and in the election and all this, like what is the correct thing? Because obviously you have people who say, okay, APAC control everything, and you have then people who say like, no, this is just whatever. So what's the truth in your opinion?
so the Israeli government works very hard, I think, to get to know members of the American Congress. When I was in office, I went, I think at the end of my first term, to Israel with a group. It was called Project Interchange, and you went with somebody from the Jewish community in your district. And in that case, we this I'd had enough. I'm a reporter, right? And my at heart, and my wife will say the one thing you do is to tell me don't go in that door because it's the one thing I really want to do, which is to go into that door. And so I sort of got a feeling like we may have frozen up here. There we
I'm
go.
sorry, you fro
Now, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? You
Yeah.
froze.
Yeah. So
Uh,
sorry.
yeah,
Okay.
let's you're still frozen. I think I can hear you, but it's the Israeli internet, I guess. It's not very happy.
Do you want me to? I don't know how much time we got left.
Yeah, no, usually it will come right back. I can see you, I can hear you. It just froze. Usually it will take a second.
Okay.
But yeah, if you can go. Oh, here we go. All right, if you can go from the start. So, you were talking
Sure.
about your visit to Israel.
Yeah. So I went. So we went to Israel, and then we went to some of the. We went up to see where some of the Druses were in the north, and we traveled around. We didn't go up to the Golan Heights, but you could see where it was. But anytime we transited, we were like with cops and driving fast through places. So I called the U.S. Embassy and said, I feel like I'm sort of being pulled around by the nose, and I got to see something else. And they said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I'd like to go to the East Bank, to the Palestinian territories. And they said, well, we can arrange that. Give us a day. So they called back and said, here's the story. You can meet some folks from the UN. They'll meet you in East Jerusalem. Tell them wherever you want to go. You can go to Hebron, Jericho, Ramallah, you name it. You go. They'll show you around and talk with stuff. And I said, yeah, but I said I wanted to go to Gaza too. And they said, well, no. And I said, well, I want to talk to the ambassador. So the ambassador gets on the phone. He goes, Mr. Klug. He said, yes. He said, happy to help you out. I'm glad we can get you settled with the UN folks, and they'll take a good sense of you, and you'll get a sense of what it looks like from the ground in the East Bank. And I said, yeah, but I want to go to Gaza. And he said, let me make this very clear to you. You don't go to Gaza. I don't go to Gaza. Nobody from the embassy goes to Gaza. Do you know what Gaza looks like? He says it looks like downtown Manhattan. It's 18 and 15 and 17-story tall buildings. And if you go into that canyon, you may never come out again. So you're not going to Gaza. That was 1992. So that'll tell you how long there's there. So the Israelis do work it very hard. In my district, it really, sometimes APAC can raise money for you and deliver it. They never did in my case. I was never in one of those sort of battleground states. It's more of an issue, I think, in the Northeast than any place else. Maybe in Chicago, where there's a large Jewish community, maybe in Southern California. But they do have an outsized influence. But I do think in the current regime, with the Abraham Accords, there's been a real attempt to knit Israel, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, everybody all together in a coalition. Clearly, Oman's not doing that because they're the closest point to the Iranians where the strait comes together. But I think the rest of the country, the Arab countries, have been much more publicly pro-American than they were for 10 or 15 years. And I think we're trying to figure out a way to get that done and build a coalition against Iran. But, they really don't have a lot of military assets, and I really think would just as soon stay on the sidelines if they could. So that was a miscalculation, I think, by the Trump folks.
Yeah, no, definitely. But you don't think when you hear like oh, Benjamin Netanyahu is the one that made the war, you think that's true? That's valid?
I think it's valid but the Israelis have always had an outside influence compared to any other country in the
Yeah.
Middle East, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, probably just because of how important it's been to the oil industry. But they work it in a way that other folks do. And I would think that if you're Netanyahu, who picks up the phone versus the Prime Minister of Spain, who Trump's in a fight with, or probably even Zelensky, the calls get returned much faster.
Oh yeah.
Um, and so
No,
there's an
I think everybody have some sort of influence. Israel obviously have a very strong, and Saudi Arabia as well, but maybe Israel even more. Qatar a little bit, but not anymore. In terms of like getting some things done. But there's one thing to have influence on policies regarding you and policies of U.S. foreign policy in general. I think that should be and I feel there's more leaning towards getting with the war in Iran itself. Obviously we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapon, but 6 months ago we just said we hit them up. So I don't know. I feel they have more influence than they should. And the America First, I like the idea. It just, never really happened, you know. Um,
Yeah, and so if you ask me some of the things I like the Trump folks have done, I don't like the way it's been handled. But when you think about it, I'm a guy who spent a lot of time on the German Marshall Fund. I was part of the French American Young Leaders Program. I'm all over the historic relationships between the U.S. and Europe. But if you think about this, since the end of World War II, we've been writing the check for the defense of Europe for materials and troops and men. And that's, think about it, from 1950 to today is 75 years. The US was writing the check for NATO. That's stupid. I mean, and so I think the Trump administration was right to actually tell NATO, the Germans should pay their own way. I mean, I think on the one hand, if you look at Putin and his expectations for the Ukraine war, here's what he's gotten out of it. He ended up managing to get Sweden and Finland into NATO when they always were neutral on it. He's managed to develop a weapons industry in Ukraine that's probably it's probably literally the best defense construction industry in Europe at that point. And now he's going to get Germany rearmed, which is never really a good thing for the Russians. So and it'll be interesting to see at some point, because I think even if I think the one thing about Iran we should keep in mind is just think if this happened to a U.S. city, how long it would take to rebuild infrastructure. I mean, they've flattened their defense industry.
yeah.
They've destroyed most of it. They could take the bridges out, although I think you run the risk of making more of the world mad at you, because then you can't get food to places that are going to need it because all the bridges will be out. And you really can't take the energy systems out because they won't have power at hospitals and stuff. So the decisions going forward get a lot more difficult. Now, the interesting thing, I remember at one point Trump told the Israelis to knock it off, to stop killing the Iranian leadership, because you weren't quite sure who you could negotiate with if they were gone next week. I wouldn't be surprised if the next step, if they break the treaty, is to go after more of the leadership again and sort of start that and see if they can leave a couple people standing who understand they don't want to answer the phone at night. So
Yeah, my personal opinion, and then I'll give you the last question. It's I think for the Israelis, not about nuclear weapon or anything. I think they see Iran in the weakest position ever, and it's a golden opportunity to even send them back even more, but has nothing to do with anything else, nuclear weapon or anything like that. Um, so my last question is voting, for country over party. Why still nobody, I mean, I would say not nobody, but 90% don't do it, why you think that is? And this is one thing that I feel like was the difference between politicians, say in the 90s and 80s and 70s and now.
I think party discipline is back in a way it hadn't been for a long time. Now with the Supreme Court decision, the parties are going to put a lot more money into the campaigns directly, which they couldn't before. And so if you get districts that are redistricted, so they're fairly red or fairly blue, there's no reward for bucking the party, right? Because all you're doing, unless you're a very strong personality, is probably signing your own death warrant, which happened with Cassidy. So the warning signs are out there for everybody. At some point, though, I think the country just gets, I hope the country gets to a point where people are rewarded for people who vote their conscience rather than just pulling a party lever. And if you look at party loyalty scores now, they're pretty crazy high. Just about everybody is. There's probably only, I would say, at most 20 Democrats and 20 Republicans out of 400 plus who will do that. And out of the 100 in the Senate, there might be 10 or 11 people. But as we said, starting the show, sadly for me, Bill Cassidy's not going to be one of them going forward, who I think is a great senator and somebody who we need more of, who's willing to stand up for principles. One of the things I did when I first got elected, and it was, when the vote was going to happen on Desert Storm, it was sort of touch and go, because there were blocks on both sides. And it was literally one of my first votes in Congress. And Newt Gingrich grabbed me and said, "Can we go in the back of the hall and talk for a few minutes?" So I go back with Newt, and he said, "Look, we're watching this. We now got enough Democrats that'll vote for this. So we don't need to, you can take a walk and vote against the war resolution because, Madison, Ann Arbor, Berkeley, they were the hearts of the anti-war movement in the 60s, where the guy I beat had come out of. And I said, look, trust me, at some point in my political career, I'm sure I will be a pain in the ass. I don't know where and when. Trust me. And Newt would verify that if he got him on the show today. But I said, some things you got to vote for as a matter of principle. And if I vote to go to war and it turns out wrong, I made the call. And if I lose an election, so be it. There's some things that are much bigger than getting reelected. And sadly, I think we've lost a lot of that kind of spirit in the country.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly, party discipline. And I think that's also come from the more division we have, the more you gotta choose a team, the more we're gonna protect you if you're part of the gang, So
Yeah.
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 And last prediction, blue wave, red wave, or independent wave?
A little blue wave. I don't think it'll be as big as people think it is because there aren't as many districts in play. If you watch John Kornacki bending over the backboard on election night, frantically adding things up, that even in Wisconsin now, we have out of 8 seats, and we're a swing state. There's maybe 2 House seats that can go back and forth. There's hardly any Republicans left in Illinois. I mean, there was a redistricting bloodbath in Illinois that Democrats did 2 years ago. So there's not much of a battle there. So when you start to add that up, there's just that many seats the Democrats can win outright. And, this redistricting game that's gone on is right now marginally better for Republicans. But the thing, again, for your political junkie fans, the story of the election 5 years from now will be this reshuffling of the population and the demographics and what it's going to do to the number of members who are in solidly blue or red states. So New Jersey, New York, California, Illinois, Michigan are all going to lose seats, and they're all going to go to Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, just because of the population shift in the country. And when we talk to some folks on another show I did a while back from the Cook Political Report, they think that's at least a dozen and could be 15. Well, there's the power balance in Congress for the next 10 years. It's got nothing to do with redistricting. It's got, back to my earlier point, is people are sorting, and they're sorting themselves to places that are largely have better taxes and are warmer, and for the most part happen to be more conservative.
Scott, thank you so much. It's been awesome as usual. How can we get you to run again?
First, I'll give you my phone number so you can talk to my wife, and then we can go from there. Because chances are, if I run again, she's going to vote against me and cancel it from the jump. So
maybe she should run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Scott, thank you so much. Do you have if people want to follow you or contact you, or do you have anything coming up, or where can they find you? Are you on Twitter?
Well, you can still find my podcast out there called Lost in the Middle, America's Political Orphans. And so there's 14 episodes that are all about 45 minutes long. They're not the same sort of chat we have. They're much like 60-minute stories. So when we talked about civility, we talked to a woman in Utah who developed the civility index. We looked at what happened in England, where members of parliament had been killed by constituents. And so all of it is pretty evergreen. So Lost in the Middle, America's Political Orphans, anywhere you find your podcasts.
Yeah, and I'll have the link in the description here so people can just click it and take a listen. Scott, thank you so much. Always great to have you. Hopefully to see you soon in NYC.
Well, I'll check with you when it gets down to the final 16 in the World Cup. And you're probably a much more of a better soccer procrastinator than I am. So we'll catch up on that.
All right. Have a good one. Thank you.
All right.